I'm very happy to welcome Dan Shapley, who's the Riverkeeper Senior Director of Advocacy, Policy, and Planning, who has developed a lot of expertise on road salt.
I'm going to talk about some of the impacts that we are seeing from road salt and specifically about drinking water impacts, because that's what is really driving the policy agenda and getting some action to reduce the impacts. And talk about what hopefully some of you can do locally in your municipalities and what we're trying to do at the state level and how you can help. You know who we are. We work on the Hudson and for drinking water. All right, so let's get into it. So first of all, just thinking about before I get into drinking water specifically, it's worth noting that road salt and the salinity of our fresh water has a really big impact on aquatic ecosystems. So even if we are not thinking about us and our use of water, this is a really important issue for all of the beings that we share our environment with. Road salt changes the chemistry of the salt water. I mean, it's obvious. Here we are at the brackish interchange of the Hudson where the salt water meets the fresh. So we were familiar with this dynamic, wonderful conditions that it gives us here. But if we're just pouring salt into our freshwater streams, we're dramatically changing the chemistry. That has what the EPA has termed producing kind of chemical cocktails, because it can cause the release of certain metals that would otherwise stay bound up in the sediments and the soils, and kind of release a number of different elements from the soils. Also, it's been linked to an overall decrease in species abundance and diversity in our aquatic systems. And it's something that some of the same scientists who back in the 70s and 80s called attention to acid rain and said, hey, we've got a problem here, it's regional, it's going to cause these profound impacts. Some of those very same scientists have called attention to this issue, the salinization of our streams, and said, this is our generation's effort worldwide that we really need to address this. So it is important. But when we think about drinking water, we are first of all thinking, most simply about sodium. Salt is sodium and chloride, at least the type that we are spreading. And that is a contributor to common health problems, right? We know that hypertension is a condition I'm sure many of us either live with, or we live with people who live with it, or we know people who live with it. A big proportion of our community has hypertension. One of the first recommendations you will get if you have high blood pressure is reduce your sodium intake. So we don't want to get sodium from our water for that reason. Of course, it's worth noting that food is really our biggest source of sodium. Drinking water, even some of the higher levels that I'll show here, is not probably the dominant source in any of our diets, but it is a component, and it's one that we can control and should. Other impacts. So as our salinity increases in our reservoirs, particularly, it can cause that same chemical cocktail release, right? We can still get those release of other unsavory things that we don't want in our drinking water, like heavy metals that can be released from the environment as the salinity changes. Also can be a trigger for harmful algal blooms, primarily in altering how a lake or a reservoir will stratify, so allow enough light to penetrate and algae to grow at the surface, things like that. So by changing the chemistry, it can change the risk factors and allow for harmful algal blooms to be more common. And change the chemistry and increase the risk of lead leaching from our pipes, so as it's in the system. So there are a number of impacts that can sort of follow downstream from having higher salinities in our source waters. And we are the current level of contamination, and this is a common thread that Riverkeeper is talking about a lot lately, where the underlying pollution burden might not be an issue right now. As the climate changes, it's going to be harder to manage in various ways, and this is an example of that, where we would think about road salt being a bigger problem right now when it's winter and we're spreading the road salt. But one of the times it really shows up is in the height of summer during a drought. That's because our groundwater is contaminated with the road salt we've spread over decades of winters. And then that in the summertime, the streams are really flowing just with that base flow of groundwater. So it's a more highly concentrated, component of the stream in those summer conditions. The salt will show up at that time. I mentioned harmful algal blooms. Harmful algal blooms are, a number of climate factors increase the risk of harmful algal blooms. We're seeing that all the time. Road salt, again, being a component of that risk. And as we increase the temperatures and lengthen the growing season, all of that becomes, a greater window of risk for us. So what are we seeing around? This is our Hudson River watershed. I'm sorry, Sound Shore folks, I don't have you on the map. But when we look out over I do have you later in the slides. But more than half of our public water supplies in the Hudson River watershed are already delivering water over 20 milligrams per liter of sodium, which is the threshold at which the health department and the EPA say, if you're on a very low sodium diet because you have hypertension or another condition, you shouldn't drink your tap water. So half of the water supplies are already over that line where we're saying you should not drink your tap water. I think that's shocking, right? That has happened without anyone knowing it, in part because it's a guideline, not an enforceable standard. And so if you look at your drinking water quality report that you get every year from your water supplier, you will see a value for sodium. But if you want to understand what it means, you have to look in the footnote and see that and find that guideline. So it's kind of a hidden issue that has emerged over decades, in part because of the kind of underlying regulation. We're seeing it pervasively, groundwaters, reservoirs, rivers, all kinds of sources. It's not, restricted to one or another type. There are other sources of sodium and chloride in our water, but road salt's the dominant component. But water softeners can contribute, wastewater discharges themselves from our sewage treatment plants can contribute, but road salt's really the dominant source. That's what all the scientists we talked to have been uniform in saying. So if we look here in Westchester County, we see a number of water systems that are reporting greater than 20 milligrams per liter of sodium. So again, over that threshold at which, if you're on a very low sodium diet, you should not be drinking your tap water according to our health recommendations. Bedford, North Castle, Croton, Somers, Mount Kisco, Yorktown, Peekskill, Rye, Rybrook, Portchester, Ossining, for those of you who might be able to not see that from the back. This indicates groundwater, certainly. A lot of these sources are groundwater sources. So in those instances, that groundwater is likely contaminated. We see Croton Reservoir, Amawak, Byram Lake, Peekskill Hollow Brook, Putnam Lake, which is actually in Connecticut, but is a source of water for some of the, I think the Rye, some of the communities. But that's not our state even, but is affected, and some of that drinking water is used by our communities in Westchester. And then Indian Brook Lake, which is one of Ossining's sources. So anything not on this list is getting their water from New York City, Catskill or Delaware Aqueduct. So that west of Hudson, the Catskills, that water is so far, there have been somewhat increasing levels of salinity, but still well below the thresholds. Our Croton side, as you've probably heard, is we've already are into a risky territory. And we're seeing basically that's indicative of what is the situation for these more localized sources in Westchester County. But really, every public water source that isn't coming from the Catskill Delaware Aqueduct is affected. Roughly 186,000 people in those areas. So this is a figure from New York City's Department of Environmental Protection. They put out a report few months ago on this issue of rising salinity in the drinking water supply for New York, with the real spotlight on the Croton system, and indicating that, within less than a century, which is a short time in planning for a community and our drinking water sources, this water supply will exceed federal standards, not just guidelines, but standards for the salinity content if we continue at the current pace. This might be hard to read, this figure, but these are watershed areas within the Croton system, leading ultimately to the Croton Reservoir and the Kensico Reservoir.
Yeah, so this is the Croton River, this is the Croton Reservoir, it's the reservoir, so I put the kind of down there be dragons with it.
So let's see, what else do I want to say about this? Yeah, DEP has labeled this an existential threat because treating the water once it gets salty is massively expensive. I mean, we're in the business of trying to help the city manage its water without filtration that every other drinking water supply in the country pretty much uses because we protect the watershed so well. This would be just the opposite. It would be not only filtration, but the most expensive energy intensive type of filtration. So this shows the Croton Reservoir. There are some communities that rely directly on the Croton or use it as a backup. Ossining, where our office is, uses it along with Indian Brook Reservoir. It's kind of a paired source at different seasons. And then Mount Pleasant, Newcastle, Pleasantville, Tarrytown, and the Montrose Water District either use it, blending with other city sources or as a backup. So directly, this is relevant to some Westchester communities. So this is looking at
Some like colors come through.
this is using roughly the same color scheme, but looking at chloride, which is what that chart was showing. But using the DEP's color scheme and looking at our Westchester water sources that are serving our communities. And you'll see a long line at the left. Those are all the water supplies that get the Catskill Delaware aqueduct water from New York City. And then everything else are the others, which are all showing levels of impact from chloride. So again, this is the DEP's color scheme at 250, that top line, that is the water quality standard for chloride. And that is set at an aesthetic level. It's not that the health impacts are there, but that's where most people start to taste salty water and complain about their water. And you start to lose public confidence and ability to really use the public water supply. So that's one way to look at it. This is I'm sorry, haven't worked with our science team to do a pretty map yet, but this is the ugly map version of that. But the same data, just sort of roughly where those water sources are in the county. And you can see they're sprinkled around. And I've done the map like this for Rockland County, for Dutchess County. It's similar. Right, as we move, at where there are road networks, where there are a lot of people, this is what we're seeing. So what can we do about it? So this is a look at not this winter, but last winter. Excuse me, the road salt delivered into Westchester County from the state contract. So the state negotiates a contract, and then most communities, but not all, use that contract to get their salt. So this is probably not a complete picture, but it's a good window in on sort of what's coming into the county. So our cities, villages, and towns combined using the most overall. Then we've got the state, DOT or throughway, which is, again, we're not going to be able to address at the local level. The state policy's got to adjust to reduce that load. And then the county itself is on the map for, 4,000 plus tons. But 143,000 tons of road salt were delivered to Westchester County. There are some perverse incentives, which I'm not going to get into and probably couldn't describe if you asked. But that state contract and the way it works is that if there's a community gets a certain amount of salt and then at the end of the winter hasn't used it, there's an incentive to sort of like waste it and spread it anyway. So there's some problems at that contracting level that need to be addressed to try to help us just use what we need. But what we're going to get to next is really what communities can do, and in many cases are doing, to just use less. Excuse me. With road salt, we've looked at all, we scientists have looked at alternatives. There's no better alternative. They all have different downsides. The real goal is just to use less of the salt that we're using now. And so that, the easiest entry point for communities, I think, is to do this, develop a road salt reduction plan. A lot of the strategies are tried and true. They're being used by neighbors. I'll call on a colleague in a minute to describe one of them, one of those communities. But it takes, these are the basic ideas, but you're measuring, the amount of road that needs to be treated and parking lots. You're calibrating the amount that's going on, and then you're, really taking steps to prevent, shading that doesn't need to happen on the roads that might be, promote icing or things like that. So it's kind of a suite of activities that can contribute to using less road salt. But the optimization is really the key thing. And what we've seen communities do, even independent much planning, is just switching to brine, switching to smart blades. And when I say I saw a skeptical look, I'm not saying importing fracking waste brine from another community. I'm saying taking our rock salt, mixing it with water, that just makes brine. You use a fraction of the amount of salt to do the same job. Basically spread it ahead of the storm. It prevents that layer of ice on the road. And then we all drive safely without, dumping tons of rock salt down like you see on this picture. So if you, again, an easy barrier, low barrier to entry thing you can do in your community and start to talk about is applying for this DEC grant program, Water Quality Improvement Program grants, part of the CFA, you're probably familiar with. So June, roughly June, July, are when the applications are due. This is a new category in the last couple of years to fund this type of work. But you can have your community create the plan, or if you're ready to implement pieces of it, like buying the smart blades for your plows, the live edge plows, or equipment needed to make the salt brine, the grant program's there for that. And the state wants to see these applications. So it's a good opportunity. As you know, working with the municipality, if you wait till June, there's no way it's going to happen. But if you start now talking about it and working towards it, it's probably an achievable goal. And we can, share the slides. I think we will. But this has sort of some basics about what you need to put in the application. References for creating a plan or finding more of the best practices that I'm just saying in the air are some really good reports. There's the Adirondack Road Salt Reduction Task Force, which was a state-funded, state-initiated, local law-initiated effort that just produced a report. There's this New York City report I mentioned. The Carey Institute, which is based just north in Dutchess County, has been working on this for like 20 years. They have excellent materials and background. And New Hampshire has also been a leader in some of this. So good reference points for developing a plan. Okay, so these are some of the examples of best management practices. These are from the New York City DEP report that just came out. Salt storage is the first. If you do have, salt, if your community is storing salt without the cover and the floor and some of those basics, that's a high priority. I think many communities will have already tackled that, but if you haven't, that's a critical, because that's just a huge pile of salt that, every rainstorm will carry into the environment. And then there's steps that your highway department consider. Pre-wetting the salt just keeps it, as I understand, from bouncing so much. So it's like you put it down and it actually stays on the road where you need it. So it's a simple way to keep it where it's useful. Salt brine instead of rock salt, as I mentioned, the live edge plows, and then temperature sensors and other equipment that's more sophisticated on the plows can also help quite a bit. And a lot of these work obviously better in combination. This is just one example. Town of Rhinebeck happens to be where I live, although I didn't make this example. An example of how these investments can pay for themselves. So the simple way of reading this is like you will make. So these aren't investments that are and with the state grants on top of it, these are investments that hopefully communities can make and see the return on fairly soon. At the state level, our best opportunity right now is a bill that we supported last year and got some momentum, and then we'll be supporting again this year. This is a Harcum bill, our friend from Peekskill, the chair of the Environmental Committee in the Senate, Pete Harcum. And it would set up a road salt reduction council and advisory committee. Riverkeeper would have a space on the advisory committee, at least as written. And the goal would be to really put the Department of Transportation on the spot to be responsible for developing the goals, but with the oversight and support and prodding of the DEC, the Department of Health, and this group of outside advisors. So we would like to, see something even more aggressive and more, get to the point faster. But this seems to be at this moment our best choice of a local law. So I believe there had been an assembly sponsor, and I forget the name, who left office, and so it's TBD who will sponsor in the assembly. But it certainly will have a sponsor. We just don't know right now who that will be. So a couple of other ways to get involved. I encourage you to join one or more of these. Riverkeeper organizes the Hudson River Lobby Day, February 24th. I can vouch for that one to the extreme because we do a great job and it's fun. You are excellent lobbyists because all you need to do is show up and say what's going on in your community and connect it to whatever we're talking about, which in this case is primarily fund our environmental programs at the state level, which is it's important. It's going to be important this year with federal cuts coming. It's important every year. So please join us. The Clean Water Lobby Day is organized by Citizens Campaign for the Environment. The Environmental Protection Fund Lobby Day, primarily by the Nature Conservancy. We can help connect you to any of them, but Hudson River Lobby Day, we go up and, go for our priorities. So we'd love to have you. We have our action alerts, nothing currently on road salt, but always look for that as a way to get involved individually and also to see, you can almost always take those action alerts. If we're asking you to send a message to your legislator, your town can pass a resolution in support of that and send it on to your legislator. You can use your power at the local level to amplify these things, and that can be very powerful. And then finally, our colleagues at Lake George Waterkeeper organized the annual Road Salt Summit. It's in Lake Placid. It's in every October. If your town highway superintendent is resistant to change, and many of them are until they hear from a colleague, this is a great opportunity to budget a couple $100, send them on a vacation to the Adirondacks where they go to this summit, they learn a lot, and there's this whole parking lot full of the technology that they can implement. And the highway superintendents from around the state who are using it and are evangelical about it. So it's a great, I think, step if you are hitting that resistance, because that is the big hurdle you will find if you start to work on this is your highway department into it or not? And if they're not, it takes them getting there through their peers, not really us, telling them what's a good idea.